What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome back to another episode of the podcast. And I'm going to cover a couple of things in this episode. I want to start by sort of laying out my near-term plan for my R5 Mark II content a little bit more in detail. I know I talked briefly about that in the unboxing video that I posted on Thursday, but I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about sort of what I'm planning on doing with that. I also want to talk a little bit about the R5 Mark II, some of the stuff that I've come across just in the course of doing things. I can't guarantee the 100% accuracy on any of this. I have not tested this stuff personally. Some of it's stuff that I have gleaned from sources, some of it's stuff that I've just run into, and maybe I missed something and I will be correcting that potentially down the road. So let me jump in and start by talking about my sort of near-term plans for the R5 Mark II content. I know I've said this, I'm not going to be discontinuing the R5 content. In fact, I think the R5 is still an incredibly relevant camera. There are certainly things the R5 Mark II does, but there are a lot of fields where people who are shooting aren't going to see benefits from the R5 Mark II, and so continuing to use or buying a new R5 simply because, well, it's cheap, or at least it's a lot cheaper than it used to be, and using that are going to be very beneficial for, as I said, some users. I'm also not discounting or discontinuing the R5C content because, again, I think the R5C is still a very relevant camera, possibly even more so in some respects or for some users than even the R5 Mark II might be. Now, personally, I really hope that Canon does an R5C Mark II that kind of blends the R5 Mark II's improved video capabilities with the R5C's vastly superior, in my opinion, video operating system and functionality. Now, I should note, this video now is actually being shot on my R5 Mark II. Not that I'm discontinuing the R5C, but that really nicely leads me into the second kind of point that I wanted to bring up, talking about the R5 Mark II content, which is I am not going to be starting anything on the R5 Mark II for at least a month. I know people want to have content out and information and so on and so forth. I would love to put it out. I would love to just dive in and hit all of the things that I'm finding that are like, you need to know this and you need to know that and you need to know the next thing, as fast as I possibly can. But here's the reality. The camera has so much new that for the first 2 days that I had it in my hands, I was basically overwhelmed by what it did. I really had to sit down, stop, and start to really slowly, carefully go through what's going on. And I've been shooting Canon gear for almost 15 years now. I'm really comfortable with their cameras and their operating systems and the nomenclature and how they go about doing things. And I still felt overwhelmed. This is the first time I've really had a camera from Canon where in the first, say, 24 to 48 hours, I was like, oh. And that includes the R5C, which shooting with the Cinema EOS OS meant that I basically had to know how to or learn an entirely new operating system for the camera that never before have used. So there is a lot of stuff on the camera. There's also a lot of stuff on the camera that is going to take me some time to get used to. So the big one that right off the top of my head is the eye control focus. I have played with it. It looks really cool in the little bit that I've played with it. But I also see how this is something that I am going to have to really get comfortable with using. It's very natural in a certain kind of way, but it also is very not normal for me and using the camera. And for something like that, or video capabilities, or networking, or really any of the stuff that is more detailed than, well, basically any of the stuff that I do content on, that's more detailed than just, here's the camera, I need some time to get used to it, get comfortable with it, and start to really understand what's going on. Some of that is going to comes through in testing. Some of that is just stuff that I need to have exposure and time to. And so instead of trying to rush content out in the next couple of weeks and just, and then be wrong, I'm going to take a month to really get comfortable with the camera. And then I'm going to start the detailed testing and content and so on and so forth. Now, that doesn't mean if I run across something, I'm not going to bring it up or not going to maybe say something or post a vlog about it or a podcast about it. Kind of like this podcast. In addition to talking about the stuff on the camera, I have run across some stuff that I thought was interesting or relevant that I kind of thought should be spread out. So, or talked about. So, I'm going to take my time getting started with the camera and the content, or the camera, making sure that I'm really comfortable with it, because I don't want to, well, first of all, I don't want to do something where I'm complaining about something because it's different. Every camera Canon releases, for better or worse, changes things. And on one hand, this is, a great ability of theirs to sort of improve and iterate on the user interface. On the other hand, it means that every camera generation, there's something different in the user interface that you have to learn to deal with. Different is always something that people have issues with. And as much as I like to try to embrace change, difference is also something that it doesn't work the way the old way did, and that's bad. Sometimes things that are changed are, super obviously, clearly better in some way, shape, or form. For example, Canon going from 2 dials to 3 dials. Yes, there's some little teething issues, but the reality is that change is so much better for us as photographers to have shutter speed, aperture, and ISO all directly accessible on dials and under our control, that it's different, but it's not something that you have to be like, well, I've got to get used to this change. On the other hand, things like the new autofocus settings or areas on the R5 Mark II, or the new multifunction dial or dial control menu on the R5 Mark II, or even just the menu system, are things that are different enough that they're different, but not clearly yet. It's not clear to me yet from using it whether it's an improvement or if it is a not so much of an improvement or a regression. So again, I'm going to take some time. I'm going to get comfortable with the camera. I'm going to start putting together the things to test and look at and so forth. And I'm going to slowly work out from there. I'm also planning to take a little bit of time in the next couple of weeks to work on some content for my other channel that I have started recently. I haven't talked about it an awful lot, but if you're interested in model trains or model railroading, I have started a new channel because I'm trying to get back into that hobby to sort of just de-stress a little bit from the stress of cameras and camera photography and the sort of attitude and content, or the attitude that I kind of get from some people on camera content, and do something that's a little bit more fun, but I'm also documenting the process. I'll put a link to that channel in the description. I know probably most people aren't going to be interested in that, so don't feel that you need to go subscribe or whatever. But I'm going to take a little bit of time to work on that, which is going to probably push some of the content a little bit. Now, like I said, I'm not stopping on the regular content, the channel content. That's still going to keep going. So with that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about some stuff that I've run into with the camera support side of things. Now, the first part is I got a question on the unboxing video that I thought was really interesting, which is, can you use the BG-R10 battery grip from the EOS R5 on the R5C? And I'm not going to say with authoritative certainty that you can, or that you should. I'm going to say that it mounts. It has zero problems mounting to the camera, which is actually, I guess, pretty good in some respects, and it seems to work. I didn't test every possible feature and function and control and everything, but when I had it mounted to the camera, powered the camera up, took a picture, and I could shoot with that, so it it seems to work. Now, the question on that, and the whole question for that is, of course, why did they need to create a BGR20 to go with the R5 Mark II? I don't know. I also don't know how the BGR10 is going to handle high current draw situations with the new batteries and, say, shooting high resolution, high frame rate video or that kind of thing. Those situations where those LPE6Ps are going to be really essential to getting the camera to function. But on the topic of the old battery grip sort of fitting and seeming that it may be usable or workable, I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of camera support stuff. This is a big thing for me, largely because all of my tripods either have Manfrotto quick release video heads or video plates on them, or Arca Swiss style or Really Right Stuff style plates and clamps on them. And so I need plates and clamps for all of my cameras. Because the battery grip and the BGR10 and BGR20 are so similar, I did try putting my Really Right Stuff L plate on the BGR20 to see if it works. And so far it seems like it fits. It mounts properly, it seems to fit and align correctly with the battery grip. It clears the battery tray so you can pull the batteries out and whatnot and put them back in. It also seems to not interfere with the ports any more than an L plate does normally, and of course you can slide it out and all that for that. So I don't know if Really Right Stuff is going to release an R5 Mark II specific L plate, or the L plate that you're going to want to use if you are a Really Right Stuff user is just going to be the R5 plate and it just translates over. The bigger question and sort of sticking point for the moment is camera cages, and specifically camera cages for the CFR20 EP, so the cooling fan base for shooting video. Obviously, the camera cage can't block the front because that's where the intake is, and obviously the camera cage can't block the back because you have to be able to open the doors to get the batteries out. I'm assuming that companies like SmallRig and Tilta will have camera cages for the video shooters coming in the somewhat near future. It's the only thing that kind of makes sense. And hopefully those will be, well designed to integrate around the cooling fan base, especially, not just the battery grip or the battery grip with the Ethernet port. Now, that said, and I completely recognize that this is a huge sort of niche edge case, because I have both the cooling fan base for when I'm going to be shooting a lot of video and the standard battery grip for everything else, and switching between them. And my kind of grumble on this is, this would have been a really nice camera for Canon to have come up with a better way to quick release or quick mount the battery grip or cooling fan base. Something that was a very fast locking mechanism instead of having to go through screwing everything into the tripod socket and whatnot. I said, I recognize that this is a super niche sort of situation, that the vast majority of people out there are not going to be dealing with this kind of thing. They're going to pick one or the other. They're not going to be changing bases regularly. And quite honestly, it's not that big of a deal to tear down and rebuild the camera for a different kind of shoot. But I do think it would have been something that, or it would have been something that I would like to have seen maybe a little bit, I want to say better, but better, more quick releasey, forward thinking kind of way. I think it would be a nice improvement. Now, the other thing I guess on battery grips that also I think would be a nice improvement is something that Nikon has actually done historically. I'm not even sure, they may still do it, but certainly back in the D700, D800 era, the battery grips for the D700, D800 could be configured to take the batteries for the D3 and D4. Gives you a bigger, higher power battery, and in the case of Nikon, more shooting capabilities. Now, Canon doesn't really, until the R5, hasn't really throttled the camera down due to batteries. R5 kind of does that. The R5C kind of does that if you aren't using the E6P batteries. It throttles down what the camera can do due to power consumption. But they also have big batteries for the EOS R1 and R3. And I've always really liked this idea of battery cross compatibility between the 1 series or the top professional series and the next tier down. Because the reality is if you're a Canon shooter and resolution is the important thing to you, the EOS R1 is not the camera for you. It's only 24 megapixels. The same thing goes with the R3, it's only 24 megapixels. Very much tuned for sports photography and action and more general purpose photography, but when resolution is the thing that matters, the R5 is the camera, the Canon camera that you want. Or now the R5 Mark II even. On the same token, if you're traveling with multiple cameras, because I had this happen to me back in 2016 when I did a road trip through the Southwest and I had an EOS 1 and an R5, or a 5D Mark III, you got to carry a whole lot more infrastructure. Now, yes, the R5 Mark II does use the new LPE6P batteries, but the charging infrastructure is all the same. I also chucked my E6P battery the first day I got the camera in my R5 to see if the camera would need a firmware update to use the battery, and it worked just fine. I haven't tried it in my R5 or my R5C, but I'm expecting that will power up and work just fine too. So if you do have an R5 or an R5C and you are using an R5 Mark II or you're getting an R5 Mark II, especially if your LPE6NH batteries for those older cameras are already in the red, not doing the best recharge performance routine and so forth, and you're considering replacing them, you can go E6Ps across the board. That said, even if you don't go E6Ps across the board, because they all use the same charger, it's not a big deal to charge them. You just have to make sure you're putting the right batteries in the right cameras. Where that kind of goes back to what I was saying about the 1 series. Well, if you're carrying an R1 and an R5, you got to carry 2 chargers now, or travel with 2 chargers. And if you have limited space in your carry-on or your luggage or just in general, that means you're taking 2 chargers for 2 different kinds of batteries, no compatibility. And given the fact that we now have 3 different grips for the R5 Mark II, we've got the straight battery grip, we've got the battery grip with the 2.5 gigabit Ethernet port, and we have the cooling fan base with a 2.5 gigabit Ethernet port. It doesn't seem so far-fetched to me that Canon could have done or could do a 4th battery grip that gives you the ability to use the batteries from the R1 in the R5 Mark II instead, or as a thing. So that's just a thought on the battery grip side of things. I also wanted to briefly talk about dynamic range, because this is the thing that everybody gets super hyperactive about and overly concerned about, and I really don't anymore. The reality is things look right now as the dynamic range on the R5 Mark II is slightly worse than the dynamic range on the R5. And so this primarily applies at ISOs 500 and lower. Above that, they're basically the same, but above ISO 500, pretty much everything turns in about the same dynamic range anymore. Now that does mean that the camera no longer has class-leading dynamic range. The R5, especially at ISO 400, has the widest dynamic range of any camera, or any 45-ish plus megapixel camera on the market. That's not the case with the R5 Mark II anymore. Now, that said, while the dynamic range is a little bit worse, and if you're one of these people that's super about dynamic range, and you're a landscape shooter, which is pretty much where that super dynamic range point comes in, then you might want to consider not getting or sticking with an R5. Because again, this is one of those situations where, and that's probably the key situation in my mind is landscape photography, where The R5, I think, just is marginally better, at least in terms of dynamic range. It still has 99+% of the features that matter when it comes to resolution, autofocus, etc. And it's going to be a lot cheaper. So something to bear in mind if you are in that little niche of like super high dynamic range concerned people, or people that are super concerned with dynamic range, and you're looking at the R5 Mark II and you're thinking about maybe that. That said, as I said, it's down, but at least according to the tests from Photons to Photos, and they use photographic dynamic range, which is not engineering dynamic range, and I personally like that as a metric for photography, because it basically, the difference between the two is Photons to Photos photographic dynamic range uses the bottom limit's a signal to noise ratio of 20 dB. Engineering dynamic range, the bottom limit is a signal to noise ratio of 0 dB or 1 dB, 0, whatever, a signal to noise ratio of 1. That's what I mean to say, not dB, 1 and 20. And anyway, what the photographic dynamic range is going to tell you, is telling you, is that there's still detail in the shadows. A signal to noise ratio to 1, that's when noise equals signal, and there's no recoverable data there at all. And, as you go up a couple of stops from that, there's going to be very little recoverable data in those stops. So kind of having a slightly higher threshold makes sense from I'm talking about pictures. And I think as a photographer or a filmmaker, whatever, your ultimate goal has to be pictures and not, pixels. So anyway, according to them, the R5 Mark II still turns in better dynamic range performance than Nikon Z8 and Z9. And that doesn't matter whether you're using the electronic shutter or the first curtain electronic shutter. And we're really only talking about it ISOs below 400. Above, again, 400, 500, pretty much everything turns in the same performance. It's also better than the Z7 Mark II, which has better dynamic range than the Z7 and Z8, or Z8 and Z9, at least at ISOs above 100. So, with the exception of 400, I should add. So 400 on this is kind of the worst of the low ISOs, and the dual pixel or the dual ISO translation point is like a stop or a third of a stop higher than it was on the R5. So it's now showing up at like 500. It jumps up to the better quality instead of 400. Now, what does that mean? Well, not a whole lot, really. It doesn't mean anything about brands or quality or compatibility or anything like that, because the difference is really insignificant. And ultimately, the thing that I keep having to drive home to people who want to get off on dynamic range is the content of your picture is going to be far more important or far more relevant to how that picture resonates with people than the fractions of a stop of dynamic range that the R5 or R5 Mark II or the Z8 versus the Z7 Mark II or whatever gets. Compared to Sony, the A7R5 does better. It's also higher resolution, but it does a little bit better at low ISOs. And the R1 is basically what it's comparable to. And, the reality here in this respect is this is what you should expect, I think, from this point going forward. Until we see some major change in sensor design or architecture, perhaps the SPAD cascading avalanche detection that Canon has in one of their ultra-low light, high-speed cameras, perhaps if that can be miniaturized and made into something that's practical in these kinds of cameras, then we could start seeing another sort of a renaissance in terms of dynamic range. But if you look at basically everything from, say, Panasonic, Sony, Nikon, Canon, who else has full frame? I think that's pretty much it. The performance is all, at least as far as dynamic range is concerned, the performance is all basically the same. And it's really hard to try and draw, like, I mean, you can draw lines in the sand and draw straws, but the reality is that what you're shooting, how you're shooting it, color, composition, the content in the image and so forth are so much more important than the model or brand or sensor or any of that stuff at this point, that shouldn't really be a major thought or factor or consideration unless, again, you're a tiny minority of super top tier in a very specific field photographer that absolutely needs every last milli, EV of dynamic range or whatever in their pictures. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about dynamic range here is actually because it keys into sort of a broader topic that I've wanted to sort of bring up and talk about, and haven't had a good way to lead into it. Now, the question is, of course, well, why is the R5 Mark II sensor lower dynamic range, or slightly lower dynamic range than the R5s? And the answer to that is, I mean, before I get to the answer, not that I guarantee, well, anyway, because clearly, if you listen to the internet expert keyboard commanders that have never built anything electronic in their life, well, it's now a backside illuminated sensor, and clearly the consensus among those keyboard commando photographers that never engineered anything electronics in their life is that backside illumination is so much better than front side illumination that that's instantly going to change everything. And it doesn't. And it hasn't. And why? Well, part of that comes down to pixel size. Backside illumination, fundamentally what it's doing is it's moving the active area of the sensor. So if you think of the sensor as a wafer, normally you would have all of the layers of the interconnects and electronics, and then you would have the built up above where the photosensor is for the pixel. With backside illumination, you do that, and then you grind off the back, essentially, of the sensor so that the back side of the piece of silicon is what's active and receiving light, and the electronics are on the other side. Now, backside illumination does have advantages, especially when you have very small pixels. Now, 45 megapixels on a full frame sensor doesn't quite get into the very small pixels where that becomes relevant. It can be a little, possibly, maybe, but not very significantly. The reason for this is that the pixel's big enough that the depth of the pixel versus the area that the pixel is working in, so you can think of the shadows that would be cast by the built-up electronics, isn't significant. Now remember, there's still micro lenses on top of this that are focusing the light down onto the photo site at the bottom of the pixel. Those micro lenses for ages now have been gapless, meaning they cover the entire area of the pixel, including the area that's got the electronics around the edges, or the in between the pixels, I should say. When you get down to things like cell phone cameras and you have a 45 megapixel cell phone camera, yeah, backside illumination becomes a big deal. But in the 45-ish megapixel range on a full frame sensor, it's not that relevant. So why is the R5 II's dynamic range worse? Well, I think, and this is purely my speculation, I think it has to do with frame rate and read speed. The faster you read information with an analog to digital converter, or the faster you make the analog to digital converter to run, with the idea that you, of course, need to process more pixels per second, because that's how you're going to get your fast rolling shutter times and so on and so forth, the less time there is for everything to stabilize and the more noise you end up at the bottom end. And this is something that doesn't just apply to Canon, it applies to anybody who's doing high-speed readouts. Depending on how they architect it and what they do, but the faster you try to read the sensor out, the faster you try to get that converted from digital or from analog into a digital signal, the more noise that's going to be inherent in that process. And as far as I know, this is going to be true regardless of what you do with the analog to digital conversion. Ideally, the best way that you would get faster readouts on the camera with less dynamic range, or less noise, so more dynamic range, is to have more analog to digital converters. So, back in the late 2000s, cameras had maybe 4 or 5 channels worth of analog to digital conversion. And that meant that if you had, say, a 21 megapixel camera like the EOS 1DS Mark III, you had a lot of pixels going through maybe 6 analog to digital converters, and they had to run pretty fast, but then the camera also didn't shoot that fast of a frame rate. Fast forward to better sensor designs. Sony was one of the first companies that started doing this. They started putting analog to digital converters on the sensor package itself, and one for basically each row. So now if you've got a sensor with, say, 4,000 rows, then you've got 4,000 analog to digital converters, and they all only have to process 6,000 pixels as opposed to a whole lot more. Next step up from that would potentially be column layout analog to digital converting. So now instead of having, say, 4,000 converters, you have 6,000 converters, one for each column, that only have to process 4,000 pixels. So they're going to be a bit faster, or they're going to have less data to process in the same time, so they have longer time to settle. Now, ideally, I guess the ultimate end goal would be to have analog to digital conversion at each pixel. So if you have a 45 megapixel sensor, you have 45 million analog to digital converters, and you get 40, if you've got, say, a 5 milliseconds or 4 millisecond shutter processing time, not to be confused with rolling shutter time, then you've got all of that time for each pixel, and you don't have to break that up for 10 pixels or 1,000 pixels or something like that. On top of that, I think the stacked sensor is also partially to blame. Now, obviously, getting data off the sensor faster is something that we want. This is reduces rolling shutter time when shooting video, gets us faster shutter speeds when we're shooting stills, etc., or faster capabilities when shooting stills, etc., including faster shutter speeds potentially. Definitely, there's definitely benefits to that. But the thing about engineering is nothing is free. There's no free lunch ever. So if you put more electronics on the sensor to do processing, early processing, all the processing, whatever it is, well, those added electronics add heat, because that's what electronics essentially do. And so that added heat is going to contribute to thermal noise, which noise is the antithesis of dynamic range. It's the thing that ruins it, essentially. And so you're now talking about more noise causing from the added electronics, causing potentially a reduction in dynamic range. Now, I don't know if that's all the case. There could also be variability that isn't being discussed or determined in terms of, say, the exact differences or whatever. Who knows? But clearly the sensor turns in slightly worse dynamic range than the R5 Mark II. Now, again, what we get for a little bit less dynamic range at the lowest possible ISOs is a lot faster rolling shutter and a whole lot better capabilities across the board. So again, given that your picture is going to not be, your picture isn't going to be made or broke by a few tenths of a stop or a fraction of a stop of dynamic range, it's going to be made or broke by what you're shooting. But the reason I brought this up and the reason I'm talking about this is it leads me into something that has been incredibly frustrating to me for a long time. And I've seen this for ages in photography, and I've seen this for ages in the computer industry and the tech media and whatnot. And that is an obsession with focusing on technology at the expense of understanding or talking about what you actually need. An example of this is I have seen numerous people post not only in comments on my videos, but on various discussion forums around the net, things like, I will never buy a Canon camera again until they use backside illuminated sensors. Well, now we've got cameras with backside illuminated sensors. And in the case of the R5 Mark II, the backside illuminated sensor doesn't give more dynamic range than the front side illuminated sensor in the R5. So what exactly were you what exactly is somebody who's saying that asking for? Better tech, by the name of better tech, is not always what we want or what we should be talking about. As photographers or cinematographers, we should be talking about dynamic range, color response, color accuracy, rolling shutter time, power constraints, power usage, things like that. Because that's ultimately what matters to the thing that we produce. Now, granted, a lot of us understand that, and a lot of us are talking about that, and that's where we focus things. And as much as I get into the engineering in a lot of my videos and discussions, I still try to keep the focus in the end on talking about what this means as a cinematographer, filmmaker, photographer, whatever. But we need, as a collective, as a group, to really stop thinking about tech points unless that tech point directly corresponds to, and I don't mean, and what by directly here, I don't mean, well, it could contribute to an increase of this, that, or the next thing. I'm talking directly is a thing that we need. And then even then, we should be really careful about focusing on the tech instead of focusing on the thing that we really need. So just food for thought. If you ever catch yourself thinking about or saying something in a discussion somewhere about how you need your camera to have X technology, and that technology is maybe how the sensor is made, or the process node that the processor in it is made at, or whatnot, you should really probably stop for a minute and think, is that what's really important for you? Or is the thing that you're trying to not say, or the thing you're trying to sound like you know more about what you're saying than you're really saying, the important part? Specifically, if you need more dynamic range, if your goal, if you want Canon to come out with a camera that has 16 stops of photographic dynamic range, which would probably need 18 stops of actual dynamic range, you should not anywhere on the internet or in your discussions be saying how Canon should use this sensor technology. You should be saying Canon should come out with a camera that produces 16 stops of dynamic range. Because that's what you need. And yes, I know, again, the technology side of things gets really interesting, but the technology is the technology, and the pictures are the pictures, and it really behooves us all as photographers, and I've fallen into this trap in the past, and I probably will again in the future, to not differentiate the two. Put your camera nerd hat on and talk about the camera nerd stuff, but when you actually start talking about photography, take that hat off, put your photographer hat on, and think about and talk about the stuff that you need that's actually relevant to photography. Okay, so this one has probably run a lot longer than I wanted it to. Sorry about that, I guess. In any event, if you found this interesting, let me know by hitting that like button. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you're not already. You can also help and support this channel in a couple of ways. If you'd like to help us, you can do this for free by liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, or sharing this on your social networks of your choice with people that you think would also find this interesting or relevant. You can support us directly by hitting that thanks button or buying yourself something you've always wanted from one of the affiliate links in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.